It was an ordinary afternoon when Jaden Williams, a 16-year-old high school student, decided to take his usual route home after school. As he walked through the peaceful, tree-lined streets of the affluent neighborhood where he lived, his mind was on a variety of things: his upcoming math test, plans for the weekend, and maybe even stopping by the park for a few minutes before heading home. Jaden had been walking this route for years now, ever since his family moved to the area. The Williams family was well known in the neighborhood. His father, David, was a high-ranking officer in the city police department, and his mother, Monica, was a lawyer. Despite the family's success, Jaden was no stranger to the occasional suspicious glance from certain neighbors. He knew that not everyone was as accepting of a black family living in the area, but he had never expected those casual glances to turn into something as serious as what was about to happen on this seemingly normal day. As Jaden continued down the street, he noticed Susan Miller, a woman in her late 50s who lived a few houses down from him, standing on her front porch. She had lived in the neighborhood long before the Williams family moved in. She was known for being nosy, always keeping an eye on the neighborhood from her porch or through her window. On this particular day, Susan seemed to be paying extra attention to Jaden. Her eyes followed his every move as he walked past her house. At first, Jaden didn't think much of it. He had seen her watching him before, but today her gaze felt more intense, more hostile. He could almost feel her suspicion, as if she was trying to figure out whether he belonged in this part of town. It wasn't the first time Jaden had been judged based on the color of his skin, but something about today felt different. As he walked by her house, Susan stepped closer to the edge of her porch, squinting her eyes as if trying to recognize him. Her expression was one of distrust, her lips pursed in disapproval. Jaden could hear the faint sound of her muttering something under her breath, but he couldn't make out the words. He kept his head down, determined not to engage with her. He just wanted to get home without any trouble, but Susan wasn't going to let him pass by so easily. She pulled out her cell phone, her fingers moving quickly as she dialed a number. Jaden could hear her voice behind him, growing louder as she spoke to whoever was on the other end of the line. He slowed his pace, not wanting to draw attention, but curious enough to catch snippets of what she was saying. Yes, there's a suspicious young man walking through the neighborhood. No, I don't recognize him. He looks like he doesn't belong here. Yes, I'm sure. The words hit Jaden like a punch to the gut. He knew exactly what was happening. Susan was calling the police on him, assuming that because he was black, he couldn't possibly live in this wealthy, predominantly white neighborhood. His heart began to race, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had been raised to know how to handle situations like this, to remain composed and not give anyone a reason to escalate things further. He kept walking, pretending not to hear her. His house was only a few blocks away, and he thought if he could just make it home, everything would be fine. Maybe she wouldn't press the issue, or maybe the police would realize there was no real threat and move on. But Susan wasn't backing down. Jaden glanced back to see her still on the phone, her voice now louder and more urgent. She was describing him in detail, his clothes, his backpack, his skin color, as if he were a criminal. And then he heard her say it. He's loitering and acting suspicious. You need to send someone right away. Jaden's stomach twisted. He had done nothing wrong, but he knew that in situations like this, that didn't always matter. He picked up his pace slightly, not wanting to appear like he was running, but eager to get home before the police arrived. He could feel Susan's eyes burning into his back, and he knew she was watching his every move. As he turned the corner onto his street, Jaden's mind raced with what he should do next. He could text his parents, let them know what was happening, but a part of him that didn't want to worry them. His dad had already had enough stress at work and his mum was busy with a big case. He didn't want to add to their burden. But as he heard the faint sound of police sirens in the distance, he knew he couldn't handle this alone. He pulled out his phone and quickly typed a message to his father. "Dad, I think the cops are coming. Some woman called them on me. I didn't do anything wrong, but they're on their way." He hit send, hoping his father would see the message in time. Just as he put his phone back in his pocket, Jaden noticed the flashing lights of 2 police cars approaching from the opposite end of the street. His heart sank. This was really happening. The police were coming, and he knew they weren't going to be friendly. The squad cars pulled up to the curb a few feet away from Jaden, and 2 officers stepped out. They were both white men, and their expressions were serious. One of them, Officer Michaels, immediately placed his hand on the handle of his holstered gun, while the other, Officer Thompson, approached Jaden with a stern look on his face. "Hey, kid," Officer Thompson said, his voice sharp. "What are you doing here?" Jaden took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm just walking home from school," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Really?" Officer Thompson asked, his tone dripping with skepticism. "You live around here?" Jaden nodded. "Yes, sir. I live just down the street." Officer Michaels, still standing by the squad car, chimed in. "You got any ID on you?" Jaden shook his head. "No, sir. I don't carry my school ID with me." Officer Thompson crossed his arms, his expression hardening. "Well, we got a call saying you were acting suspicious. What's that all about?" Jaden glanced over his shoulder to see Susan standing on her porch watching the scene unfold. Her arms were crossed, and she had a smug look on her face, as if she was satisfied that her call had brought the police. Jaden felt a surge of anger, but he pushed it down. He had to stay calm. He had to stay in control. "I wasn't doing anything wrong," Jaden said, his voice quiet but firm. "I was just walking home." But the officers weren't convinced. They continued to question him, their suspicion growing with every word Jaden spoke. The tension in the air was palpable, and Jaden knew that things could go very wrong if he didn't handle the situation carefully. As the questioning continued, Jaden could feel the weight of the officer's doubt pressing down on him. No matter what he said, it seemed like they were determined not to believe him. The fact that he was simply walking through his own neighborhood, something anyone else could do without a second thought, had turned into a full-blown confrontation because of the color of his skin. He had heard stories about things like this happening to other black men and boys, but never thought it would happen to him, not here, not in the place where he grew up. The officers exchanged a glance, their body language radiating suspicion. Officer Michaels, still with one hand resting on his gun, took a step closer. "You're telling us you live around here, huh? What's your address?" Jaden felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He knew the answer, but the way the officer asked the question made it feel like a trap. Still, he had no choice but to respond. "I live at 421 Maple Drive. It's just a few houses down that way," he said, pointing in the direction of his home. Officer Thompson raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. 421 Maple Drive? That's a pretty nice area for a kid like you." Jaden's heart sank further at the thinly veiled implication. "Yes, sir. That's where I live. My family moved here a few years ago." Officer Michaels chimed in, his tone laced with disbelief. "And we're just supposed to take your word for it?" The frustration building inside Jaden was becoming harder to suppress. He wasn't a criminal. He hadn't done anything wrong. Why were they treating him like he was lying? Like he didn't belong in his own neighborhood? I don't know what else you want me to say, Jaden replied, trying to keep his voice calm despite the frustration rising in his chest. If you just let me walk down the street, I can show you where I live. I have a key to my house. My parents will be home soon. Officer Thompson's eyes narrowed as he studied Jaden's face. Why don't you just stay right here for now? We'll figure this out, he said, his tone patronizing. Jaden felt trapped. He could feel the officer's suspicion mounting despite his efforts to explain himself. It didn't matter that he had done nothing wrong. In their eyes, he was already guilty of something. He just didn't know what. He looked around, noticing that a few neighbors were starting to gather nearby, watching the scene unfold from their yards or front porches. Some of them had concerned expressions, while others looked curious, like they were waiting to see what would happen next. But none of them intervened. None of them spoke up. As the moments dragged on, the tension only grew. Jaden couldn't help but glance over at Susan, who was still standing on her porch, her arms crossed and a satisfied smirk on her face. She hadn't said a word since the officers arrived, but her presence was looming over the entire situation. Jaden knew that she was the one responsible for all of this. She had made the call that brought the police here. She had assumed that because he was black, he didn't belong. Jaden took a deep breath and reached for his phone again. He knew he had to let his parents know what was happening. His dad would know how to handle this. He opened his text messages and quickly sent another message to his father. "Cops are here. They won't believe me. Please come." As soon as the message was sent, Jaden slipped his phone back into his pocket, hoping his father would get there soon. He didn't know how much longer he could keep his cool in the face of the officer's thinly veiled accusations. He had been taught all his life how to behave in situations like this, to be respectful, to stay calm, to avoid sudden movements. But it wasn't easy. Every second felt like a test, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could pass it. Officer Michaels stepped closer, his expression hardening. "I'm going to ask you again, you got any weapons on you? Any drugs?" Jaden's eyes widened. "No, I don't have anything like that. I'm just walking home from school." "Why are you acting so nervous then?" Officer Thompson asked, his voice sharp. "I'm not nervous," Jaden replied, though his heart was pounding in his chest. "I just want to go home." But the officers didn't seem to care about his pleas. They kept pressing, asking more questions, circling him like they were waiting for him to slip up. The more he tried to explain himself, the less they seemed to believe him. Just as the situation was about to escalate even further, Jaden noticed something out of the corner of his eye, a familiar car pulling up to the curb. His heart lifted with relief as his father's black SUV came to a stop a few feet away. The door swung open and David Williams stepped out, his face a mixture of concern and barely contained anger. David was a tall, imposing figure, his years of service in law enforcement evident in the way he carried himself. As soon as the officers saw him, their expressions shifted. Officer Michaels straightened up, his hand dropping from his gun. Officer Thompson's questioning glare softened into something more neutral. It was clear they recognized David. He was their superior after all. David walked toward the officers, his eyes scanning the scene before landing on Jaden. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Officer Thompson cleared his throat, suddenly seeming less confident. We got a call about a suspicious person in the neighborhood. We were just checking it out." David's gaze flicked to Susan, who was still standing on her porch, watching the scene unfold. He knew exactly what had happened. This wasn't about Jaden being suspicious.
This was about the color of his skin. That suspicious person is my son, David said, his voice cool but firm. He lives here, right down the street.
Officer Michaels opened his mouth to respond, but David cut him off. "I don't want to hear any excuses," he said, his tone sharp. "You're harassing my son because someone made an assumption, and that's not how we do things." The officers exchanged uncomfortable glances, realizing they had made a serious mistake. But it was too late to take back what had already been done. The damage was done, and Jaden had been subjected to the kind of treatment that no one should have to endure. David turned to Jaden, his expression softening. "You okay, son?" he asked. Jaden nodded, though his heart was still racing. He was relieved that his father was there, but the anger and frustration he felt didn't just disappear. The situation had diffused, but the incident wasn't over, not by a long shot. The tension in the air was still thick as Jaden's father, David, turned his focus from the police officers to Susan, the woman who had called the police in the first place. She hadn't moved from her spot on the porch, her arms still crossed defensively, but the confident smirk she had worn earlier had all but disappeared. Now, faced with the reality of her actions, she looked nervous, almost as if she was reconsidering what she had done. David took a slow, deliberate step toward her, making it clear he wasn't going to let her off the hook so easily. "You," he said, his voice low but firm. "You're the one who called the police on my son." Susan flinched slightly at his tone, but quickly regained her composure, her defensive posture hardening again. "I did what I thought was right," she said, her voice clipped. "I saw someone I didn't recognize wandering around, looking suspicious. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood."
Jaden watched as his father's jaw tightened. David had spent years working in law enforcement, and he had seen this type of situation play out too many times before. White people calling the police on black individuals simply because they felt something was off. It was a textbook example of racial profiling, and the fact that his own son had been the target of it infuriated him. "Protect the neighborhood?" David repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. "From what? A kid walking home from school?"
Susan's eyes flicked between David and the police officers, who were now standing off to the side, clearly uncomfortable with the way things were playing out. She opened her mouth to respond, but seemed to hesitate, unsure of what to say. "He was acting strange," she muttered weakly, "like he didn't belong here." David shook his head, his eyes narrowing. "You mean he didn't look like you?" he said, his voice hard. "So you assumed he was up to no good. You didn't even bother to consider that he might actually live here. You just called the police without a second thought." Susan's face flushed red, and for a moment she looked like she might argue, but the weight of the situation seemed to hit her all at once. She glanced around, noticing that more of the neighbors had gathered, watching the confrontation unfold. Some of them were murmuring quietly among themselves, clearly disapproving of Susan's actions. "I didn't," she started, but David wasn't finished. "You didn't stop to think," he said, his voice rising slightly, though still controlled. "You put my son's life in danger because of your assumptions. Do you understand that? Do you even realize what could have happened here?"
Jaden watched as Susan's confident facade began to crumble. She shifted uncomfortably on her porch, her arms falling to her sides as she struggled to find the right words. It was clear that she had never anticipated things escalating to this point. To her, it had probably seemed like a simple call to the police, nothing more. But now, faced with the consequences of her actions, she seemed to be grappling with the gravity of what she had done. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Susan mumbled, her voice barely audible. David took a deep breath, his anger simmering just below the surface. "Whether you meant it or not doesn't change the fact that you did it," he said. "You called the police on an innocent teenager because you decided, based on nothing but his appearance, that he didn't belong here. And that's not okay." The crowd that had gathered around them was growing larger, and the murmurs of disapproval were becoming louder. Some of the neighbors were shaking their heads, while others were openly glaring at Susan. It was clear that she was losing the support of the community, and she knew it. Her face flushed deeper with embarrassment, and for the first time she seemed to truly understand that she had made a terrible mistake.
I didn't think," she stammered, her voice trembling slightly. "That's the problem," David said sharply. "You didn't think. You acted on your biases, and now you've put my son through something no kid should ever have to experience."
The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of unspoken truths. Jaden stood by his father's side, his heart still pounding from the adrenaline of the situation. He hadn't expected his father to come down so hard on Susan, but at the same time he was grateful. Someone needed to hold her accountable for what she had done, and his father wasn't the type to let things slide, especially when it came to protecting his family.
But Susan wasn't the only one who needed to answer for her actions. David turned his attention back to the officers, who were still standing awkwardly to the side, trying to remain out of the line of fire. "And as for you two," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife, "I expected better." Officer Michaels and Officer Thompson exchanged a nervous glance, clearly unsure of how to respond. They had been caught in a difficult situation, but that didn't absolve them of their own role in what had happened. "We were just responding to a call," Officer Michaels said defensively, though his tone lacked conviction. "You responded to a call, but you didn't ask the right questions," David shot back. "You didn't assess the situation properly. You took her word over my son's even though he was doing nothing wrong. You immediately treated him like a suspect." Officer Thompson shifted uncomfortably, rubbing the back of his neck. "We didn't mean any harm," he muttered. "That's not the point," David said, his voice sharp. "The point is that you let your own biases cloud your judgment. You didn't give my son the benefit of the doubt. You treated him as guilty until proven innocent, and that's a problem." The officers had no response to that. They knew David was right. They had made a mistake, and now they were standing in the aftermath of it, with nothing to say in their defense. The silence stretched on, heavy with the weight of everything that had been said. Susan looked like she wanted to disappear, her earlier confidence completely gone. The officers stood stiffly, clearly regretting their handling of the situation. And the neighbors, who had gathered to watch, seemed to be coming to their own conclusions about what had happened. Jaden stood quietly next to his father, feeling a strange mix of emotions. On the one hand, he was relieved that the situation had de-escalated and that his father had arrived to back him up. But on the other hand, he was still angry. Angry that it had happened in the first place. Angry that Susan had assumed the worst about him and that the police had treated him like a criminal without a second thought. As the confrontation wound down, David turned to Jaden and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Let's go home, son," he said softly. "We'll deal with this later." Jaden nodded, grateful to be leaving the situation behind. But as they walked away, he couldn't help but glance back at Susan, who was still standing on her porch, looking smaller than ever. He wondered if she truly understood what she had done. And he wondered if this would be the last time something like this happened, or if it was just the beginning. As Jaden and his father walked back toward their house, the weight of the incident still hung heavy in the air. The quiet of the neighborhood felt surreal after the tense confrontation that had just unfolded. Jaden's thoughts raced. He couldn't believe that what had started as a simple walk home had turned into such a massive ordeal. He wasn't just shaken, he was angry, frustrated, and confused all at once. David remained quiet as they walked, his hand resting gently on Jaden's shoulder. The calmness in his father's demeanor reassured Jaden, but he knew that underneath, David was just as furious as he was. His father had been composed in front of the officers and Susan, but Jaden knew him well enough to sense the seething frustration just below the surface. As a police officer himself, David had dealt with racial profiling and systemic bias more times than he could count, but when it happened to his own son, it hit differently. It was personal. When they finally reached their home, Jaden could see his mother, Lisa, standing on the front porch, her face tense with worry. She had been notified when Jaden texted during the confrontation, and though she hadn't been able to come with David, she had been waiting anxiously for their return. As soon as they reached the porch, Lisa rushed over and wrapped Jaden in a tight hug. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but full of concern. Jaden nodded against her shoulder, feeling a wave of relief wash over him as his mother's familiar warmth enveloped him. "Yeah, I'm okay now," he murmured, though the tremor in his voice betrayed just how rattled he really was. Lisa pulled back and looked at him closely, searching his face for any sign of distress. "I was so worried," she said, her brow furrowing. "When your dad told me what happened, I couldn't believe it."
Jaden shrugged, trying to play it off as if it didn't bother him as much as it actually did. "It's fine, Mum," he said, though the words felt hollow. "I'm used to people like her."
David, who had been standing quietly beside them, shook his head. "You shouldn't have to be," he said firmly. "None of this should have happened, but we're going to make sure it doesn't go unaddressed." Lisa glanced at David, a silent understanding passing between them. They had always known that raising a black son in a predominantly white neighborhood would come with challenges, but this incident had crossed a line. It wasn't just an uncomfortable encounter, it was a blatant act of racial profiling that could have ended much worse. David and Lisa had always taught Jaden to be strong, to keep his head up in the face of adversity, but there was only so much a teenager could bear before it became too much. "Come inside, both of you," Lisa said, her tone firm but gentle. "We need to talk about what we're going to do next." Once inside the house, Jaden plopped down on the living room couch, feeling a sense of exhaustion settle over him. The adrenaline from the confrontation had worn off, leaving him feeling drained. His parents sat down across from him, their expressions serious. "We need to talk about pressing charges," David said, breaking the silence. "That woman filed a false police report. She put you in danger, Jaden. We can't let that slide."
Jaden blinked, surprised at the suggestion. He hadn't thought much beyond the immediate events of the afternoon. The idea of pressing charges against Susan hadn't even crossed his mind. "Press charges?" he echoed, his voice uncertain. "I mean, will that even do anything?" David nodded, his expression resolute. "It will send a message," he said. "People like her need to know that they can't just call the police on someone because they don't like the color of their skin. It's not only immoral, it's illegal, and she needs to be held accountable." Lisa chimed in, her voice softer but equally firm. "Your dad's right, Jaden. This isn't just about you. It's about the principle of it. If we don't take action, it sends a message that what she did was okay, and it's not. We've worked too hard to make sure you feel safe in this world, and no one has the right to take that away from you."
Jaden looked between his parents, feeling a mix of emotions. On one hand, he wanted to move past the incident as quickly as possible. He didn't want it to define him or linger in his mind. But on the other hand, he understood the importance of standing up for what was right. Susan had wronged him, there was no doubt about that. And if his parents believed pressing charges would make a difference, then maybe it was the right thing to do. What would that even look like? Jaden asked hesitantly. Pressing charges, I mean. David leaned forward slightly, his tone thoughtful but firm. It would mean filing a formal complaint against her for making a false report to the police. We'd have to contact a lawyer, and there would likely be a court case. It wouldn't be easy, and it could take time, but it's the right thing to do. We need to show her and anyone else who thinks they can get away with this kind of behavior that there are consequences. Jaden nodded slowly, absorbing his father's words. It all sounded daunting, but there was also a certain clarity to it. Susan had made a serious mistake, and if no one ever stood up to her, she might do it again. Maybe to someone else, maybe with even worse consequences. Lisa placed a comforting hand on Jaden's knee. This isn't something we have to decide right now, she said gently. We'll take our time, think it over, and do what's best. But just know that whatever we decide, we'll stand by you. We're in this together. Jaden took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. He appreciated his parents' support, but the idea of dragging this out into a long legal battle was overwhelming. At the same time, he couldn't shake the thought that if they didn't do something, Susan, and others like her, would continue to act on their prejudices without consequence. I'll think about it, Jaden said finally, his voice quiet but determined. David nodded, clearly respecting his son's need for space. That's all we ask, he said. The room fell into a contemplative silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Jaden stared out the window, watching the last remnants of the day's light filter through the trees. The events of the afternoon replayed in his mind, the confrontation with the police, Susan's accusatory glare, his father's commanding presence. It was all so surreal, yet it was a reality that too many people like him had to face. But no matter what happened next, Jaden knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. Whether they pressed charges or not, this incident had left its mark on him, and it had sparked something inside of him. He wasn't just a kid who had been wrongfully accused. He was part of a larger fight for justice, for fairness, and for equality. And that was something worth fighting for. The following days were filled with a quiet tension in the household. Jaden's mind continued to dwell on the incident, and the weight of deciding whether to press charges against Susan felt heavier by the hour. He could see his parents were eager to stand up for him, to make sure Susan faced the consequences of her actions. But for Jaden, it wasn't that simple.
While on the one hand, he was still angry. He hadn't been able to shake the image of Susan's accusing eyes, her unwavering certainty that he didn't belong. The feeling of being judged, of having his very existence questioned in a place that was supposed to be his home. It was something that gnawed at him. He'd been raised to believe that standing up for yourself was essential, that doing the right thing sometimes meant confronting uncomfortable truths. But on the other hand, Jaden wasn't sure if he wanted to draw more attention to himself. He was just a teenager after all, and the thought of being the center of a public controversy made his stomach turn. What would his friends think? What would the other kids at school say if this blew up into something bigger than it already was? There was no going back once they made the decision to press charges, and Jaden wasn't sure he was ready for that level of scrutiny.
His parents, though supportive, had also given him space. They hadn't pushed him to make a decision right away, which Jaden appreciated, but every conversation, every glance carried an unspoken question. What are we going to do about Susan? One evening, as Jaden sat in his room scrolling through his phone, he heard a knock at the door. "Come in," he called out, already knowing it would be his father. David stepped in, his expression calm but serious. He closed the door behind him and sat on the edge of Jaden's bed. "We haven't really talked much about what happened," David began, his voice gentle. "I know you're still processing everything. I just wanted to check in and see where your head's at." Jaden put his phone down and sat up, his thoughts swirling. "I don't know, Dad," he admitted. "I'm still really angry about what she did, but I'm not sure if pressing charges is the right move. I don't want to make things worse."
David nodded, clearly understanding the conflict Jaden was feeling. "I get it," he said. "This is a big decision and it's not one we're taking lightly, but I want you to know that no matter what we decide, we're doing it because we believe in standing up for what's right. You didn't deserve what happened to you, and it's not just about punishing Susan. It's about making sure people like her understand that they can't get away with this kind of behavior." Jaden looked down, picking at the edge of his bed sheet. "What if it turns into something bigger?" he asked quietly. "Like, what if it goes viral or something? I don't want to be the kid who's known for getting racially profiled." David sighed, his expression softening. "I know it's scary," he said, "but here's the thing. You didn't do anything wrong. You didn't ask for this. And if people talk about it, it's not a reflection of you. It's a reflection of the world we live in. And sometimes the only way to change things is by shining a light on the problem."
Jaden thought about that for a moment, his father's words settling over him. It was true that he hadn't asked for any of this. He had just been walking home, minding his own business, and suddenly his world had been turned upside down. He wasn't the one in the wrong, yet it felt like the burden of fixing the situation had fallen on him. David leaned forward slightly, his tone becoming more earnest. "We're not doing this for attention," he said. "We're doing it because it's the right thing to do. What Susan did was wrong, and if we don't stand up now, it could happen again, to you or to someone else. You have the chance to be a part of something bigger than yourself, Jaden, and I know that's a lot to ask, but it's also an opportunity to make a difference." Jaden felt a knot form in his chest. He wanted to make a difference. He really did. But the thought of all the attention of being thrust into the public eye made him anxious. He wasn't sure if he was ready for that kind of responsibility. "I'm scared, Dad," Jaden admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. David reached over and placed a reassuring hand on Jaden's shoulder. "It's okay to be scared," he said gently. "This isn't easy, and no one expects you to have all the answers right now. But just know that whatever decision you make, we'll stand by you, we'll fight for you, and you won't be alone in this." Jaden nodded, appreciating his father's words. He had always admired David's strength, his unwavering sense of justice. It was clear that David believed in doing the right thing, no matter the cost. And while Jaden wasn't sure if he could be as strong as his father, he also knew that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something bigger. The next day, Jaden's family had a meeting with a lawyer who walked them through the process of filing charges against Susan. The lawyer explained that it wouldn't be an easy fight. Susan would likely try to defend herself, and there was a chance the case could drag on for months. But the lawyer also made it clear that they had a strong case. Susan had filed a false police report, and the police body cam footage would show that her accusations were unfounded. As the lawyer outlined the potential outcomes, Jaden felt a mix of apprehension and determination. He didn't want to be the part of a long, drawn-out legal battle, but he also couldn't shake the feeling that this was the right thing to do. Susan had wronged him, and if they didn't hold her accountable, what was to stop her from doing it to someone else?
Later that evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Jaden made his decision. "I think we should go ahead with the charges," he said quietly, his voice steady but resolute. "I don't want her to get away with what she did. It's not just about me, it's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." His parents exchanged a glance, a mix of pride and concern in their eyes. David nodded slowly, his expression serious. "We'll stand by you every step of the way," he said firmly. "This won't be easy, but you're doing the right thing." Jaden felt a wave of relief wash over him. The decision had been made, and while the road ahead would be challenging, he knew that he wasn't facing it alone. His family was with him, and together they would see this through.
The next day, the lawyer began the process of filing the charges, and Jaden braced himself for whatever came next. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. He was no longer just a victim of Susan's prejudice. He was standing up for himself and for everyone who had ever been wrongfully judged because of the color of their skin. As news of the charges against Susan spread, Jaden's family became the focus of neighborhood conversations. Initially, neighbors offered only polite nods, creating an atmosphere of tension. Jaden, who usually felt invisible, now faced whispers and curious stares at school. Local news picked up the story, reporting on Susan's charges for filing a false police report but avoiding the racial implications. This prompted discussions among residents, with some beginning to show support. Mrs. Martinez, a neighbor, visited with a casserole and expressed solidarity, encouraging Jaden's family to stand firm. However, not everyone was supportive. Jaden overheard women at a coffee shop downplaying the incident, suggesting it was overblown. Their dismissive comments stung, reminding him of the realities of racism he faced daily. When Jaden shared this with his mother, Dana expressed understanding but frustration at those who didn't grasp the situation's seriousness. Meanwhile, Jaden's father, David, informed them that local news wanted to interview them about the incident. Although nervous about the attention, Jaden recognized the importance of speaking out against injustice. Ultimately, he decided to participate in the interview, realizing that this was bigger than his discomfort. It was about advocating for those unfairly judged because of their skin color. The day of the interview arrived quickly, leaving Jaden with a mix of anxiety and determination. The family had agreed to meet reporter Rachel in their living room, a familiar space that made Jaden feel more at ease. Rachel was warm and reassuring, explaining how the interview would unfold and encouraging Jaden to take his time. As the interview began, Jaden felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about local news. It was a chance to speak for those who had experienced racial profiling. His mother, Dana, emphasized that while they were pressing charges against Susan, their goal was to address systemic racism. "My son didn't deserve to be treated like a criminal just for walking down the street," she asserted. Jaden's father, David, who worked as a police officer, echoed her sentiments. He expressed disappointment in how the officers had handled the situation, highlighting that assumptions based solely on skin color could have led to dangerous outcomes. "My son shouldn't have to rely on luck to avoid these situations," he said firmly. When it was Jaden's turn, he felt his heart race as the camera focused on him. Remembering his father's words about standing up for something bigger, he began, "I've lived here my whole life, but that didn't stop someone from assuming I didn't belong." He spoke about the pain of being seen as a threat due to his skin color and how many others faced similar experiences without a platform to share their stories. As he finished speaking, the room fell silent. Rachel praised Jaden's bravery and thanked him for sharing his story. After the interview wrapped up, Jaden felt a mix of relief and uncertainty about how people would react. The segment aired that evening and responses flooded in. Social media buzzed with support from across the town and beyond, but there were also hateful comments and anonymous calls accusing them of exaggerating their experience. While hurtful, Jaden's parents encouraged him to focus on the positive responses. In the days following the interview, Jaden's story gained national attention. Major news outlets reached out, and civil rights organizations offered support. Through it all, Jaden recognized that this fight was not just his. People from diverse backgrounds united in support against injustice. For the first time since the incident with Susan, Jaden felt hopeful that real change was possible. Although uncertain about what lay ahead, he knew he wasn't alone in this journey. As Jaden's story gained national attention, the legal battle against Susan, who had falsely reported him, took center stage. Jaden's family knew that pressing charges for filing a false police report would attract scrutiny, but they saw it as a necessary step toward justice for their son and others affected by similar experiences. David, Jaden's father, consulted civil rights attorney Marcus Wheeler, known for tackling high-profile racial discrimination cases. Marcus emphasized that their goal was not just to win, but to set a precedent. This case is about holding people accountable for their actions, he stated. The case quickly attracted media coverage, thrusting Jaden's family into the spotlight. Despite the attention, they remained focused on their mission, seeking justice rather than revenge. Jaden struggled with the idea of facing Susan in court. He didn't want her to go to jail. He wanted her to understand her mistake. During dinner one evening, Jaden expressed his feelings to his parents. "I just want her to understand what she did was wrong," he said. Dana reassured him that accountability was essential to prevent future incidents. David echoed this sentiment, emphasizing the need for consequences to deter similar actions. As the court date approached, tensions rose in the community. Some viewed the family's actions as an overreaction, while others saw it as a pivotal moment in addressing racial injustice. On the trial day, the courtroom was packed with supporters and reporters eager to witness the proceedings. When Susan entered, Jaden noted her nervous demeanor, so different from their initial confrontation. The trial began with Marcus presenting a clear case against Susan, highlighting the broader implications of racial profiling. He stated, "Racial profiling is not an isolated incident. We're here today to send a message that this behavior is unacceptable." Susan's attorney attempted to frame her as a concerned citizen acting in good faith. However, as witnesses testified, including police officers and neighbors, evidence against Susan mounted. The most powerful moment came when Jaden took the stand. Facing the judge and crowded courtroom, he recounted his experience of being treated like a criminal in his own neighborhood due to his skin color. "I don't want this to happen to anyone else," he declared emotionally. By the end of his testimony, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Even Susan appeared moved by Jaden's words. For the first time since the incident, he felt truly heard. And now, it was up to the court to decide what would happen next. The courtroom was tense after Jaden's testimony. His heartfelt account had left an undeniable impact, but the trial was far from over. With the weight of his words still lingering in the air, Marcus Wheeler knew they had to capitalize on the momentum Jaden had created. The next step was to reinforce the case with more evidence, and Marcus was ready to show that this was about more than just fear or a misunderstanding. It was about systemic racial bias that could no longer be ignored. Following Jaden's testimony, the prosecution called a series of experts on racial profiling to the stand. These were professionals who had spent years studying the issue and advocating for reforms in how police and communities handled situations involving people of color. Each expert delivered powerful insights into how subtle biases could lead to devastating consequences, even in seemingly safe or affluent communities. One of the most compelling witnesses was Dr. Olivia Patel, a sociologist who had conducted extensive research on racial disparities in policing. She began by outlining statistical data showing that black individuals were far more likely to be stopped, questioned, or arrested by police than their white counterparts, even when they lived in the same neighborhoods or committed similar infractions. Unfortunately, this case is not an anomaly, Dr. Patel explained to the court. It's part of a broader pattern of racial profiling and discrimination that people of color face every day, whether they are driving, walking, or simply existing in spaces where others assume they don't belong. Susan's defense attorney objected, trying to argue that the expert's testimony was irrelevant to this particular case. But the judge overruled the objection, allowing Dr. Patel to continue. Her testimony provided the necessary context to show that Susan's actions weren't just a result of individual fear, but were rooted in a systemic issue that affected people like Jaden all over the country. Meanwhile, Susan sat quietly at the defense table, her eyes downcast. It was clear that her defense strategy was crumbling under the weight of the prosecution's arguments. Even her own attorney seemed to be struggling to come up with a viable counter-narrative. Susan had never anticipated that her actions would result in such a public reckoning, and as the trial continued, the consequences of her choices became more and more apparent. But despite the powerful evidence being presented, the defense was determined to fight back. They knew that if they could cast even the slightest doubt on the racial profiling angle, they might be able to sway the jury. Susan's attorney shifted tactics, focusing on portraying her as a well-intentioned, albeit misguided individual who had simply made a mistake in a moment of fear. Their next witness was a psychologist specializing in anxiety disorders. The defense argued that Susan's actions could be attributed to a heightened state of fear, and that her call to the police was less about Jaden's race and more about her own emotional instability. The psychologist testified that Susan had a history of anxiety and that she had been particularly on edge in the weeks leading up to the incident due to recent break-ins in the neighborhood. Susan's actions were not racially motivated, the psychologist claimed. They were the result of an irrational fear triggered by her anxiety. In her mind, she genuinely believed there was a threat to her safety, and she acted accordingly. This testimony, while painting Susan in a more sympathetic light, didn't go as far as the defense hoped. While the jury might have felt some empathy for Susan's anxiety, it didn't fully explain why she had automatically assumed that Jaden, a teenager simply walking home, was a threat. The racial undertones of the case were still undeniable, and Marcus was ready to challenge the defense's claims. During cross-examination, Marcus focused on the psychologist's admission that Susan had no prior interactions with Jaden, and that her fear had been based purely on an assumption. Is it true, Marcus asked the psychologist, that Susan's fear was based entirely on the fact that she saw a black teenager in her neighborhood? There was no threat. There was no crime. Just a young man walking down the street. Is that correct? The psychologist hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the question. Yes, that is correct, he admitted, but her anxiety... Thank you, Marcus interrupted, cutting him off before he could deflect. He didn't need the psychologist's explanation about anxiety. He had made his point. Susan had seen a black teen and, without any real reason, had assumed the worst. As the trial wore on, it became clear that the defense had little ground to stand on. The evidence of racial profiling, combined with Jaden's emotional testimony and the expert witnesses brought in by the prosecution, painted a compelling picture of what had happened that day. The defense's attempt to frame the incident as a misunderstanding fueled by fear simply wasn't strong enough to overcome the facts. However, the trial wasn't over yet, and there was still one more key moment that everyone in the courtroom was anticipating: Susan's own testimony. Would she take the stand and try to explain her actions, or would she stay silent and leave her fate in the hands of her attorney? The decision was crucial, and both sides knew it. Marcus had been preparing for this moment. If Susan testified, he would have the opportunity to cross-examine her, to directly confront her about her actions, and force her to acknowledge the racial bias that had driven her call to the police. He was confident that he could dismantle whatever narrative the defense tried to build around her testimony. The defense, on the other hand, was divided. Susan's attorney wasn't sure if putting her on the stand was the right move. If she came across as defensive or unsympathetic, it could backfire. But if she didn't testify, it might look like she had something to hide. In the end, the decision was up to Susan. She spent several sleepless nights agonizing over whether to testify. She knew that her words could potentially sway the jury, but she also knew that if she misspoke or became too emotional, it could hurt her case. She had already been publicly shamed and vilified for her actions. Did she really want to endure more scrutiny in front of a courtroom full of people? Finally, on the last day of the trial, Susan made her decision. As the judge called the court to order and the defense prepared to present their final arguments, her attorney rose and addressed the room.
"Your Honor," he said, "the defense would like to call Susan Miller to the stand." A murmur spread through the courtroom as Susan slowly stood and made her way to the witness stand. Everyone knew that this would be the turning point, the moment that could either salvage her defense or seal her fate.
As Susan took her seat and was sworn in, the courtroom fell into a tense silence. All eyes were on her as she prepared to give her version of the events. What would she say? How would she explain herself? And most importantly, would the jury believe her? Marcus sat back in his chair, watching closely. He knew that no matter what Susan said, he would be ready. He was confident that the truth was on their side, and he wasn't about to let her testimony derail the case they had built so carefully. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and the courtroom was bracing for the final act of this gripping trial. As Susan Miller settled into the witness stand, the air in the courtroom thickened with anticipation. She took a deep breath, glancing at the jury before focusing her attention on her attorney, who stood ready to guide her through this critical moment. The gravity of the situation weighed heavily on her. This testimony could either turn the tide in her favor or lead to further scrutiny of her actions. "Please state your name for the record," her attorney prompted gently. "Susan Miller," she replied, her voice wavering slightly as she looked around the courtroom, the eyes of the jury and the audience fixed on her. "Miss Miller, can you tell us what happened on the day in question?" he asked, keeping his tone calm and encouraging. Susan nodded, her eyes shifting nervously. "I was at home when I noticed a young man walking down my street," she began, her voice picking up a bit of strength. "He looked out of place. I had heard about some break-ins in the neighborhood recently, and I was concerned." "Concerned for your safety?" her attorney prompted. "Yes," she admitted, looking down for a moment. "I thought he might be up to no good." As she spoke, Marcus felt a mix of frustration and resolve. He knew that this was Susan's chance to justify her actions, but he also knew that it was essential for him to be ready to confront her statements head-on during cross-examination. "Miss Miller, did you take any steps to assess the situation before calling the police?" her attorney asked. "I didn't think I needed to," she said defensively. "I just saw him standing there, and it scared me. I thought I was doing the right thing."
Marcus felt his blood boil at her words. The idea that she could dismiss the gravity of her assumptions with such casualness was infuriating. He would have his chance soon enough to make her face the consequences of her actions.
Miss Miller, her attorney continued, do you believe you made the right decision by calling the police? I thought so at the time, she replied, her voice growing more uncertain. I didn't want to take any chances. As her testimony continued, Marcus found himself mentally preparing for the impending confrontation. Susan's defense hinged on the idea of fear and misguided intentions, but he was determined to expose the underlying bias that had fueled her decision to call the police in the first place. When it was finally Marcus's turn to cross-examine her, he rose slowly from his seat, his mind racing with questions. He approached the stand, locking eyes with Susan, who looked visibly nervous. Miss Miller, he began, his voice steady but firm, you mentioned that you saw Jaden standing on your street and that he scared you. Can you explain what exactly it was about him that made you feel that way? He was a young black man, she stammered, the words hanging awkwardly in the air. Isn't it true, Marcus pressed, that you made an assumption based solely on his appearance? There were no other facts or evidence to suggest he was doing anything wrong? Susan hesitated, her face flushing as she realized the implication of his question. I just thought, it was a strange situation. Marcus leaned in slightly, his tone unyielding. But he was simply walking home from school, correct? He had every right to be there just like anyone else. Why did you choose to see him as a threat rather than a neighbor? The courtroom was silent, the tension palpable as Susan struggled to respond. I don't know, she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I guess I let my fear take over. Your fear, Marcus echoed, which ultimately led to a false police report and a traumatic experience for an innocent teenager. Isn't that true? Yes, she replied reluctantly, tears welling in her eyes. Miss Miller, isn't it also true that you've had no prior interactions with Jaden or anyone like him before that day? Marcus pressed further. Your reaction came from a place of bias, did it not? The room held its breath as Susan's defense crumbled. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, she managed to say, but it sounded hollow in the courtroom where the echoes of her earlier testimony weighed heavily against her. Marcus continued relentlessly. In your mind, did you truly believe that Jaden was a criminal just because he was a young black male, or was your fear based on a stereotype that is all too common in our society? Susan's silence spoke volumes. The jury could see the discomfort and shame etched on her face as she finally acknowledged the implications of her actions. After a few agonizing moments, she broke down. I didn't want to be that person. I really didn't. But yes, I did see him differently. I know that now. Her admission was a critical turning point. Marcus could sense the shift in the atmosphere of the courtroom. The jury, composed of individuals from diverse backgrounds, was clearly processing her words. They were witnessing not just a woman's moment of vulnerability, but the broader conversation about race and bias unfolding in real time. As Susan's testimony came to a close, Marcus knew that the emotional weight of the trial was shifting dramatically in favor of Jaden and his family. The courtroom had become a microcosm of a larger societal issue, and every word spoken held the potential to change minds beyond the walls of that room. When the defense rested its case, the stage was set for the closing arguments. Both sides would have one last opportunity to sway the jury's decision, and Marcus was prepared to seize the moment. In the days that followed, the community remained captivated by the trial. Local news stations reported on each development, and the narrative of racial profiling took center stage. People were beginning to talk about the implications of the case in their own lives, sparking discussions in homes, workplaces, and online forums. As Marcus prepared for his closing argument, he felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. This was more than just a case for him. It was a chance to advocate for justice and hold individuals accountable for their actions. On the day of the closing arguments, the courtroom was packed, the air thick with expectation. Marcus stood before the jury, his heart pounding as he prepared to deliver his final statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "this case is about more than just a false police report. It's about the choices we make and the consequences that follow. It's about recognizing the biases that exist within our society and understanding that they can lead to devastating outcomes." He glanced at Jaden, who sat quietly beside his parents, their eyes filled with hope and determination. When we fail to acknowledge our fears and assumptions, we risk perpetuating a cycle of injustice. Jaden was not just a teenager walking home. He was a victim of prejudice that should have no place in our community. As he continued, Marcus outlined the evidence they had presented, reinforcing the notion that Susan's actions were not simply a mistake, but part of a larger issue that needed addressing. "We have the power to change the narrative," he said passionately, "and it starts with holding individuals accountable for their actions, regardless of their intentions." The jury listened intently as he concluded. "In this case, we must make it clear that racial profiling is unacceptable, and we cannot allow fear to dictate our actions. I urge you to find the defendant guilty of filing a false police report, to send a message that this behavior cannot stand in our community." With his final words hanging in the air, Marcus stepped down, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He had said what needed to be said, and now it was up to the jury to decide the outcome of this pivotal case. As Susan's attorney delivered the defense's closing argument, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of confidence. He had presented a strong case, and he knew that the jury had seen through the veil of bias and fear. In the back of the courtroom, the crowd buzzed with anticipation. The public's attention was riveted on this case, eager to hear the jury's verdict. Would they hold Susan accountable for her actions, or would they buy into her defense's narrative of fear and misunderstanding? As the day drew to a close, the jury retired to deliberate, and everyone in the courtroom felt the weight of the moment. The world outside awaited the verdict with bated breath. Would justice be served? The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric as the jury returned after hours of deliberation. Whispers filled the room, a mix of anxiety and anticipation as everyone settled into their seats, awaiting the verdict that could change the course of the lives involved in this case. Jaden sat nervously beside his parents, his heart racing, each tick of the clock amplifying the tension in the room. The foreman of the jury, a middle-aged man with a serious demeanor, stood as the judge entered. The gavel struck, and silence fell like a heavy blanket across the room. Everyone's eyes turned toward the jury, who seemed to exchange glances before the foreman cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we have reached a verdict," he announced, his voice steady but laced with the weight of the moment. "Please read the verdict," the judge replied, his expression grave. The foreman glanced at Susan, then at Jaden, and finally at the judge, before delivering the words that would echo in the lives of everyone present. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Susan Miller, guilty of filing a false police report."
Gasps rippled through the courtroom, and Jaden felt a surge of relief wash over him. His mother squeezed his hand tightly, tears of joy glistening in her eyes. On the other side, Susan's face fell, and the color drained from her cheeks as the implications of the verdict sank in. The judge nodded, acknowledging the decision with a serious expression. "Miss Miller, you will be sentenced to appear for a hearing on the consequences of your actions. This court takes false reports very seriously, especially when they lead to racial profiling and unnecessary distress." As the judge's words resonated, Susan's attorney leaned in to speak to her, but the despair on her face was evident. She had crossed a line, and now she had to face the fallout of her
decisions. Marcus glanced at Jaden, who was slowly starting to smile, the tension in his shoulders easing as the weight of the unjust situation began to lift. As the proceedings wrapped up, Jaden's family received congratulations from the supporters who had gathered, a diverse group that included friends, family, and community members who had followed the trial closely. They exchanged words of encouragement, and Jaden felt a newfound sense of hope, knowing that their fight had not been in vain. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, eager to capture the reactions from both sides. Jaden stepped forward, holding his parents' hands tightly. He was ready to share his story with the world, to show that courage and dignity could prevail in the face of adversity. "Jaden, how do you feel about the verdict?" a reporter shouted, microphone thrust forward. "I'm relieved," he said, his voice steady. "No one should have to go through what I did just because of the color of their skin. I hope this sends a message that racial profiling is wrong." The crowd erupted in applause, and Jaden felt empowered by the support surrounding him. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was a moment for everyone who had ever faced prejudice and discrimination. As Susan exited the courthouse, flanked by her attorney, the whispers among the crowd grew louder. Some were sympathetic, while others were less forgiving. Marcus watched from a distance, as Susan appeared to be overwhelmed by the media frenzy, reporters bombarding her with questions. "How do you respond to the jury's decision?" one journalist pressed. I made a mistake," Susan stammered, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "I didn't mean to harm anyone, I let my fear control me." Her admission was met with mixed reactions. While some expressed empathy for her realization, others were quick to condemn her for her actions, for allowing her biases to lead to such a serious incident. Marcus felt a sense of satisfaction as he saw the public discourse shifting. The case had opened up a broader conversation about race and prejudice that could no longer be ignored. He had heard discussions in coffee shops, at work, and on social media, with many people reflecting on their own biases and the need for change. The following weeks were filled with news, stories, and social media posts about the trial and its outcome. Hashtags like #JusticeForJaden began trending, and the family received messages of support from across the nation. It was inspiring to see how their story resonated with so many people, serving as a catalyst for dialogue about racial profiling and its real-world consequences. As the media coverage continued, Jaden's family received invitations to speak at schools, community centers, and organizations eager to address the issues of race, bias, and accountability. Jaden found himself sharing his experience with others, determined to educate and empower those around him. At one event, standing before a group of high school students, Jaden spoke passionately. "It's important to challenge your assumptions," he urged. "We all have biases, but we can choose to rise above them. It's not just about what happened to me, it's about creating a world where we treat each other with respect and understanding." His words resonated deeply, sparking discussions among the students about their own experiences and the ways they could foster a more inclusive environment. Jaden felt a sense of purpose growing within him, knowing that his story had the power to inspire change. As Susan's sentencing hearing approached, Marcus prepared for what would be a significant moment for both parties. The court would decide not only the consequences of Susan's actions, but also set a precedent for how such cases would be handled in the future. In the courtroom, Susan sat with her attorney visibly shaken. She had become a symbol of the prejudice that persisted in society, and now she was facing the consequences of her actions. The judge listened carefully to both sides, weighing the impact of her behavior on Jaden and the community at large. After hearing from Jaden's family about the emotional toll the incident had taken on them, the judge finally delivered the sentence. "Susan Miller, you will face community service and mandatory racial bias training," he declared. "Additionally, you will be on probation for 1 year, during which time you must reflect on your actions and engage in efforts to promote understanding within your community." Susan nodded, accepting the sentence without protest. The weight of her actions was heavy, but there was a glimmer of hope that perhaps this experience could lead to personal growth and change. Outside the courthouse, Jaden's family embraced each other, overwhelmed with a sense of victory. They had stood up against injustice, and while it was just one step in a long journey, they were hopeful that their fight would inspire others to take a stand against racial bias. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the community, Jaden looked toward the horizon, envisioning a future where understanding and acceptance would prevail over fear and prejudice. He was ready to continue his journey, knowing that he had the power to make a difference. The aftermath of the trial and Susan's sentencing reverberated throughout the community, igniting conversations about racial profiling, bias, and the importance of understanding among neighbors. Jaden and his family found themselves at the center of a movement, one that sought to foster empathy and connection in a world often divided by misunderstanding. In the weeks following the verdict, community leaders and local organizations rallied together to create forums for discussion, workshops, and events aimed at educating the public on issues of race and discrimination. Jaden's family was invited to speak at many of these events, sharing their story and engaging with attendees to inspire action. One such event was organized at a local high school. The auditorium was filled with students, parents, and teachers, all eager to listen and learn. Jaden stood at the podium, his heart racing, but filled with a sense of purpose. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, scanning the crowd. "I want to share my story with you, but more importantly, I want to talk about how we can work together to create a better community for everyone." As he recounted the events of that fateful day, the room was silent, hanging on his every word. He spoke about the fear he felt, the unjust treatment he experienced, and the support he received from his family and friends. The emotions in the room were palpable, and Jaden could see the impact his words were having. "Racial profiling isn't just about one incident," he continued. "It's a systemic issue that affects so many people, but we have the power to change that. We can choose to be better, to challenge our biases, and to stand up for each other." His speech was met with thunderous applause, and he felt a wave of encouragement wash over him. The response from the community was overwhelming, with many attendees approaching him afterward to express their gratitude and share their own experiences. One mother shared how her teenage son had been racially profiled in their neighborhood, and she thanked Jaden for giving her the courage to address the issue head-on. Another student spoke about how Jaden's story had inspired him to advocate for inclusivity at their school. As the events continued, Jaden and his family also began to notice a shift in their own neighborhood. More residents were engaging in conversations about race and equity, and they saw a rise in participation at community meetings focused on creating a safer, more inclusive environment for everyone. To further their mission, Jaden and his parents decided to collaborate with local leaders to create a community event titled Unity in Diversity. The event aimed to celebrate the rich tapestry of cultures and backgrounds within their town, while emphasizing the importance of standing together against discrimination. The planning process brought Jaden closer to his parents as they brainstormed ideas for activities, speakers, and performances that would highlight the community's diversity. They reached out to local artists, musicians, and speakers who were passionate about advocating for social change. On the day of the event, the park was transformed into a vibrant celebration. Colourful banners adorned the entrance, and booths lined the paths, showcasing food, art, and traditions from various cultures. The air buzzed with excitement as families arrived, eager to participate in the festivities. Jaden stood at the entrance with his parents, greeting attendees as they poured in. The atmosphere was filled with laughter and joy, a stark contrast to the tension that had previously surrounded their community. For the first time in a long while, Jaden felt a sense of hope and belonging. Throughout the day, there were performances that showcased different cultures, including traditional dances, music, and spoken word poetry. Jaden had the opportunity to perform a piece he had written about his experiences and the importance of unity. As he took the stage, he felt the energy of the crowd behind him. Today we come together to celebrate who we are, to learn from one another, and to stand united against hate, he said, his voice strong and clear. Let's build bridges instead of walls. Let's create a community where everyone feels safe and valued. The audience erupted in applause, and Jaden felt a sense of pride swell within him. He had turned his pain into purpose, and it was making a tangible difference. As the day came to a close, attendees lingered to share stories, exchange contact information, and discuss how they could continue working together to foster understanding and compassion within the community. Jaden's family felt a renewed sense of belonging, knowing they were part of a movement that had the potential to change lives. In the weeks that followed, the event's success led to the formation of a community coalition focused on promoting equity and inclusion. Jaden, alongside his parents, became involved in planning future events and initiatives dedicated to keeping the conversation alive and addressing the systemic issues that still plagued their community. As he walked home from a planning meeting one evening, Jaden reflected on the incredible journey he had experienced. From being a victim of racial profiling to becoming an advocate for change, he realized how far he had come. The support from his family, friends, and community had empowered him to rise above adversity and become a voice for those who felt silenced. Looking up at the sky, Jaden felt a sense of determination wash over him. He knew that the fight for justice and equality was far from over, but he was ready to continue pushing for change. With every step he took, he felt stronger, knowing that together they could make a difference. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the neighborhood, Jaden stood outside his house, reflecting on the incredible journey that had unfolded over the past few months. What began as a distressing encounter had transformed into a powerful movement, sparking discussions that were long overdue in their community and beyond. Jaden's parents had become local heroes, admired for their courage and determination in confronting racial injustice. They had received messages of support from people across the nation, encouraging them to continue their advocacy for equality and inclusion. Jaden felt proud to be part of a family that stood firm against prejudice and fought for what was right. The community coalition they had helped establish began to take root, organizing workshops, training sessions, and public forums aimed at educating residents about bias and promoting inclusivity. Jaden had taken a leading role in planning these events, using his voice to share his story and inspire others to join the fight against racial profiling and discrimination. One of the most significant initiatives was the introduction of a scholarship program for students of color, aimed at providing them with resources and support to pursue higher education. Jaden was thrilled to see the tangible impact of their efforts, knowing that it would help pave the way for a brighter future for many young individuals. As Jaden looked around his neighborhood, he could see the changes taking place. Neighbors were engaging in conversations they had once avoided, and there was a growing sense of unity among residents. People were stepping up to challenge bias when they saw it, standing in solidarity with one another. Yet Jaden knew that their work was far from over. While they had made significant strides, systemic issues still existed, and it was essential to keep the momentum going. With each event they organized, with every conversation they facilitated, they were chipping away at the walls that divided them and fostering an environment of understanding and respect. On the one-year anniversary of the incident, the community held a commemorative event titled Together We Rise. It was a day to remember the challenges they had faced and to celebrate the progress they had made. Jaden was invited to speak, and as he stood on the stage once more, he felt a surge of gratitude for everyone who had supported him throughout this journey. Today we gather not just to reflect on the past, but to look toward the future, Jaden began, his voice strong and confident. We have faced adversity, but we have chosen to rise together. Let this be a reminder that we all have a role to play in creating a community where everyone is valued, where diversity is celebrated, and where love conquers hate. The audience erupted in applause, and Jaden felt the warmth of solidarity enveloping him. This wasn't just his victory. It was a collective triumph for everyone who had been affected by prejudice and bias. Together, they were building a legacy of change, one that would resonate for generations to come. As the day came to a close, Jaden reflected on how far they had come. The support they had received, the connections they had forged, and the conversations they had sparked were proof that change was possible. They had turned a painful experience into an opportunity for growth and understanding, and that was something to be proud of. In the months that followed, Jaden continued to advocate for justice, using social media and public speaking engagements to raise awareness about racial profiling and discrimination. His story became a beacon of hope for many, encouraging them to share their experiences and stand up against injustice. As we conclude Jaden's inspiring journey, we invite you to take action in your own community. Share this story with friends and family, and start conversations about bias and understanding. Together, we can create a world where everyone is treated with respect, regardless of their background. If Jaden's story moved you, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming and thought-provoking tales that inspire change. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What actions will you take to promote understanding and inclusivity in your own life? Thank you for being part of this journey, and remember, change starts with each of us. Together, we can make a difference.